Okay, so welcome to the second lecture in for the Introduction to Sociology course in the LAT program. Um, Today I'm going to spend an hour discussing sociological theory. I'm going to be posting later today and tomorrow uh, some recorded lectures on that go into more detail for each of the different sociological theories. But today I want to first give you an overview of what it is that theorizing does, why there are sociological theories, how sociological theories relate to social phenomena, how they relate to if even they relate to your life, my life, our lives, and if they relate to our work as students and professors. And so I'm just going to take a look at who's here to get an idea. Okay, so the list is filling up. That's good. So now I'm going to turn to the PowerPoint presentation. And so I mentioned last week that the slides were put together by someone else, and the slides represent an interpretation of the chapter, which is itself an interpretation of and a summary and so on, a textbook version of the theories. And so sometimes I have a slight disagreement with the person who put the slides together. Sometimes I have slight disagreements with Bob Brim. In this case, the slide is accurate. It's Bob Brim that I disagree with. But for our purposes, I would point out that the textbook has been organized in order to highlight these four theories as they pertain to the contents of the rest of the chapters of the book in our course. If you've taken a look at the book, you'll see that the next chapter is on culture. The third chapter is on socialization, then social organization, crime, stratification, race and ethnicity, sexualities and gender, families, religion, and so on. Each of those areas of sociological research, on the one hand, and areas of sociological experience for actually existing human beings. And those are two different starting points. Each of those areas are not uniformly theorized in the same way at the same time. And so it's not the case that every single aspect of sociology is divided equally among functionalist theorists, conflict theorists, and so on. In addition to that, the theories themselves have their own histories. And so the bottom line is it's complicated. And so I want to start with some generalizations that will allow you to begin to sort out the complications involved. Now, in this respect, this textbook, like all the textbooks I've looked at, all the English textbooks, all the North American English language textbooks published in North America, in England and in Europe, the approaches are a little bit different. The emphasis is a little bit different, but we're going to take a look at sociology by and large, initially at least as it's practiced today in North America. These four theories are the most widely the most widely used theories, the theories that are most widely invoked in discussing particular aspects of sociological phenomena. They're used as tools for sociologists interested in particular fields. Now, I want to move on to. So in the textbook in chapter 1, there's a very useful slide that I think is going to be very helpful for you. And so the authors put together a chart that allows us to consider the main aspects of each of these 4 theories. And I think that's a very helpful starting point. So that's where I'm going to start, and to take a look at these 4 theoretical perspectives. Now, for the most part, I'm going to be focusing on the first 2, on functionalism and on conflict theory. But in some chapters, the other 2 aspects will be more useful and represent a more contemporary perspective on the sociological debates that are still going on in those areas. So, but I need to make this a little bit bigger there. Okay. So in terms of the overall history of sociology, as a university discipline, and by and large, that's how the book approaches it. That's how I'm going to approach it. That's a marginally incomplete approach to sociology, in the sense that many people with sociology credentials work outside the university, and from a different point of view, sociological knowledge, sociological approach, sociological theories, and sociological methods are also used in non-university settings. Perhaps the most widespread non-university use of sociological theories and methods is in polling and in surveys, and those have grown dramatically. Those have grown very significantly, especially since internet technologies, especially since people carry around in their phones, in their pockets, a telephone that allows them to, it's probably more accurate to say, almost compels them to participate in all kinds of surveys organized for all kinds of purposes. But surveys are generated using sociological theories, and most surveys are done for commercial purposes. And so that distinguishes them from some surveys done by universities. Many universities, in order to raise money, operate like a surveying company, and they contract their expertise out to clients, basically. But I'm going to focus, and the textbook focuses primarily on the development of sociology as a university discipline. And it's as a university discipline, or understood as a university discipline. Sociology is about 130, 140 years old. We'll see in a little bit some of the details of the development of sociology as a university discipline. But the 2 oldest approaches in that discipline are described in our textbook, and in most textbooks the vocabulary stays the same, as functionalism, or structural functionalism, it's sometimes called, on the one hand, and conflict theory on the other. These are the 2 most standardly compared sociological theories in intro to sociology courses. And so for that reason, I'm going to develop the content of those. Now, both of these theories was described as the main level analysis. These are macro theories. They're both mostly interested in large scale social structures. And what they're interested in understanding is, how do these large scale social structures operate? What do they do? How do they change? Whose interests do they support? At what social cost do they operate? How do they adapt to changing realities? Those are some of the main approaches, some of the main conceptual work that the theories do. And so what we have here, then the next column describes the main focus of the theory when it's applied to a particular given sociological phenomenon. So in both cases, functionalist theory and conflict theory is primarily focused on social structure. They look for descriptions of social structure. They try to generate data from social structure, and they try to understand how social structures interact among each other. So, for example, taking education as an example of a sociological phenomenon, education in the 21st century is, by and large, overwhelmingly, really, institutionalized through government. And so we have two different sorts of social structure interacting to produce and to reproduce a particular social phenomenon. Education is offered through the school system, and in the 21st century, the school system is operated by governments in many, many places around the world. That didn't used to be the case. Education used to be the purview of, if you go back far enough, education was a family issue. It was up to individuals, much, much smaller groups, to provide the education broadly understood that most humans underwent. But over the course of human history, as social structure became more and more complex, institutions were specialized to provide particular services, to fulfill particular functions in a society. And as they become specialized, they change over time. And so in the 21st century, in most places in the world today, education as an institution is organized and delivered by the government. And so the government is one social structure, the education is another social structure. How do those two interact? Again, reverting or starting from today in the 21st century, one of the key goals that educational institutions themselves describe as the purpose of the institution is to prepare people for the labor market and to fulfill the requirements of that labor market. And so, although your and my first contact with education, not just today, not just in college and university, but from the moment you start formal education, it feels like, and the institution is organized in part, I will argue, not this semester, but next semester, in a at least marginally misleading way. It looks like and it feels like the educational system is organized to educate individual students. But in fact, at the very least, in part, the educational institutions are also organized to make sure that there will be enough skills available for all of the different essential and even non-essential jobs on the basis of which society survives. So the education system doesn't just fulfill the needs of the individual students, it also fulfills the needs of the labor market. And the labor market is another social structure that sociologists study. Now, in the case of, so social structure is a common focus for both functionalism and for conflict theory. And the relationship among the different social structures that are observed in different societies, both conflict theory and functionalism are obsessed is too strong a word and it's a misleading word, but are a great deal of the work that's done by functionalists and by conflict theorists involves trying to understand how social structures work together or compete with each other or cooperate or the different kinds of relations that exist between them. That's one of the chief focuses of these two main theoretical approaches in sociology. Functionalism, in addition to trying to understand how social structures operate, as the name suggests, the functionalist theory operates on the assumption that where there are persistent social structures, that's evidence that some particular specifically social function, in addition to other possible functions for these social structures, but where they notice a general pattern that social structures exist in all kinds of different societies, functionalists tend to explore at least the possibility that these structures perform socially necessary functions, socially necessary in the sense that absent the performance of those functions, the society would become dysfunctional and eventually would cease to be. And this is really where the core conceptual difference between functionalism and conflict theory arises. In functionalism, the assumption is that social structures exist and persist over time to the degree that they contribute to the successful functioning of society overall. In contrast, conflict theory argues that social structures, so far anyway in the history of humanity, persist to the degree that these social structures further the goals and ends and interests of identifiable segments in a particular social, in a particular society. And so rather than seeing social function and functionality as the essential characteristic of a social structure, conflict theorists argue that it's inequality that is the best guidepost, the most accurate description of how social structures operate. Social structures are the result of one group successfully mobilizing resources that are available to it to further its own interests in a given social setting. Now, because or say to the degree rather that in any given society resources are finite, it logically follows that under a condition of resource finiteness, where there is competition for those resources, inequality will emerge. And so for functionalists, stability is the key characteristic of society, whereas for conflict theorists, inequality is the key characteristic of society. Now, a few minutes ago, I mentioned that I'm going to try to describe what theory is and also what it is not. And so, and over when I discuss teaching social theory with other sociology professors, and also when students, when I look at student exam answers and so on, it's clear that many students have difficulty understanding what a theory is and what a theory does. A theory is intended to be an explanatory mechanism. It's not meant, theory exists in a sense, theory exists in our heads. It does not exist in the society as such. Theories are meant to explain what we see. They're not meant to just simply describe what we see. Now, I raise that in this context because when we take a look at our own societies, we see both of these features. We see social stability, we see persistence of social structures, and we also see the connection between those social structures and the delivery, the production of socially essential results. But we also see inequality. And the challenging feature from an introductory point of view, but also in an ongoing way for sociologists who've been doing this for 30, 40 years. Both of these things seem to characterize contemporary society. We see stability and we see inequality. And even more complicated, our understanding of these structures is predicated in ways that are mutually incompatible on both of those things. So I'll take, again, as it seems to me is useful from an explaining point of view, a teaching point of view, let's start from where we are. We are in a educational setting. Usually I can say we're in a classroom, but today, this semester, we're not in a classroom. I'm in my house, you're in wherever it is you are, but we're doing most of, maybe not quite all of the same things, but we're doing most of the same things we would be doing if we were meeting in a classroom. So that's, we can start from there. And maybe the comparison, I'll try to make this up a little bit as I go along. The comparison between doing it in a classroom 2 years ago, or I guess a year ago, I was still in a classroom and you were still in classrooms. And today, doing it from wherever it is you're doing it and wherever it is I'm doing it. Both of those will reveal to us, or both of those realities, both of those realities, let's say, can reveal to us equally, or not equally, they can both reveal to us the persistence of the social structures, but also the inequalities that those social structures manifest. In a classroom, the social if this semester wasn't online and the scheduling operated the same way, we would have had to be in class. I would have been in class at 10 minutes to 8. Class would have started at 8 o'clock and it would have gone for 3 periods. Now, my experience of Monday, what do you think my experience of Monday 8 a.m. classes is? Tiring. Not so much. I don't have trouble getting up in the morning. I have trouble staying up late at night, but I don't have trouble getting up in the morning. And for what it's worth, I have a very long commute. I live 100 kilometers from the college. But no, I mean, from the point of view that matters most immediately to students, that is what happens in the classroom. What do you think a classroom at 8 a.m. on a Monday morning looks like? Exactly. Thank you, Stephen. Yes, that's right. It's hard for people to get there at 8 a.m. Now, it's hard for a number of different kinds of reasons. And this is where some of the topics will come up. For some people like me live far away from campus, and many students, unlike me, don't have their own cars. If you have your own car, basically you never have a really good excuse to be late. Now, some of you may know this, but in any event, I will tell you a hard truth about people is there's two kinds of people who are on time and the rest of you. And for a variety of different reasons, that's the way it is. That has to do with values. And one of the ways that the classroom operates is that the people who show up get the most benefit out of the whole experience. They tend to get better grades. They tend to learn more about the experience. And that's also true in general for all of the kinds of efforts that are required of or even available to people in a complex society like the societies that most of us, I think all of us, but that at least most of us live in. One of the main functions, it turns out, of the school system is to train people to get to work, to get to where they need to be on time. That's partly a question of values, but it's also partly a question of equality and inequality. Some people get dropped off by their parents. Other people, their parents give them a car, and other people, they don't have a car. They have to take transit. And when you're taking transit, it's not your fault when the subway breaks down. It's not your fault if the bus breaks down. You do know, however, though, that if you want to not be late, what you have to do is to be early. And you build into your schedule enough lead time so that if the bus does break down, you will still be able to get to class on time. The educational system is organized around that. It produces values that have, on the one hand, an instrumental outcome. How do employers benefit from having students who graduate with a commitment to punctuality? Super obvious question. Right. If you're running a business, most organizations that have employees need their employees to be there to do the work that they're doing. And so punctuality in a complex society like ours that is organized overwhelmingly around timetables and around schedules, the smooth operation, never mind the smooth operation, the operation at all of society depends to a very great degree, minimally, on people being punctual. And so the educational system produces or reproduces these values, and that serves a social function. But that punctuality is a manifestation of inequality. And I'll use a possibly controversial example, but it won't be the only controversial example I bring up, so we might as well get used to it. I suspect all of you too young to remember this, but at the very least, almost all of you are too young to remember this. But on September 11th, 2001, two planes crashed into, you all know this, but you won't remember it the way I remember it. Two planes crashed into the World Trade Center in New York City at about 10 o'clock in the morning. I was working as a researcher at City Hall in Toronto, and we regularly had the news on in our office, and we were watching the news. And so that's more or less why I remember the time. It was 10:30 or so in the morning, and the planes hit, and in those two twin towers were enormous structures, and I forget what the number was, but that morning when they realized, or maybe at whatever time it was that the two towers finally collapsed, and it was very clear it was going to be there were going to be a lot of casualties. Uh, the number, I think it went as high as 20,000 people. 20,000 people working there. Now, in the World Trade Center, lots of very rich companies had their headquarters. So there were lots and lots of people in there who worked in very high paying jobs. But over the next few weeks and months and years, when they finally were able to put together a statistical picture of what happened, it turns out that at 10:30, although the bosses all want the rest of us to show up on time, by and large, the people who were most likely to die were the people with the lowest wage jobs. So the cleaners, the secretaries, they were the people who were in the building. But at 10:30, many of the, now it is absolutely the case that many of these very high paid people, in fact, were in the building and died. But all of the low wage people had to be in there by 8, 9 o'clock in order for the rest of the work that goes on in the building to occur. Another similar kind of example that's given in a number of other sociology, probably older sociology textbooks, is the Titanic. What's the Titanic? Not the movie. What was the movie about? The Titanic was a luxury cruise ship. And on its first voyage, it was a very highly hyped, heavily marketed luxury ship. And that's an interesting point. That goes a little bit against my argument, but nonetheless, it was mostly males who died, and it was mostly the poor people. The rich people were taken off, and most of the rich people more of the rich people got into the lifeboats and survived the crash than the people in the workers on the ship, and also the people who paid a lower fee. The more you paid, the higher up in the ship you were, and the higher up in the ship you were, the more likely you were to get out alive after the ship began to sink. So one of the metaphors to describe the current way that the COVID consequences are being experienced in today in the 21st century, in January of 2021, is that we're all in the same storm, but we're not all in the same ship in that storm. And so social structure and social functions, we have in Canadian society, in Ontario, we have a very advanced, and relative to most other jurisdictions in the world, a very high functioning health system. And it's a health system that has a very high degree, that up until very recently at least, had a very high degree of support from the community. But under the stress situation that we're in right now, stress in an objective sense, that the presence of this new virus in our population is putting pressure on the available systems that we've put into place, systems that prior to the COVID were operating very well. So we in Ontario have adapted to a very high degree, had adapted to a very high degree to the healthcare requirements, given the environment that we're in. But the COVID has caught us, like everybody else, by surprise. And what that extra level of pressure has done has demonstrated the extent to which that prior socially adequate system strain on that prior adequately social system is revealing inequalities in our society. What inequalities do you think I'm referring to? It's been in the news a little bit, at least. Well, COVID is not spreading equally through all of Ontario. And the main variable, so far as I understand, right, rich people are not affected, not affected. Rich people are not as negatively affected by the virus from a health, from even just from a narrowly health point of view. More or less, the richer you are, the less likely you are to get COVID, and that's primarily or importantly a function of the fact that rich neighborhoods tend to be less densely populated than poorer neighborhoods. Exactly. So COVID is more prevalent in densely populated areas, and densely populated areas are overall less rich than less densely populated areas. Well, Nunavut is a bad example, not a good example, because Nunavut is not especially rich, but it's not densely populated. And so if you take a look at all of Canada, it is the case that in rural areas there is poverty, but in urban areas where approximately 80% of the Canadian population lives, in the rich neighborhoods, there's lower density. There are fewer people per square kilometer in rich neighborhoods than there are in poor neighborhoods. And in those neighborhoods where there is more more densely populated neighborhoods, there's a much higher prevalence of COVID, and so we get that reflects an inequality in the social structure that we have. Okay, so now I'm going to go back. Now, the two main theories operate from their main focus is a macro focus. Conflict theorists are interested in understanding what is the social structures, how do social structures produce inequality? Are there particular social structures that decrease inequality? What are the consequences for different kinds of inequality on any given society? Functionalism is interested in understanding how do adaptations to changing social externalities, how does adaptation to these changes manifest itself at the level of social structure? What is it that how have schools changed over time given the rapid change in the kind of work that's being performed? But what that leaves out of focus is how do these sociological or how do these social changes impact individuals? Conflict theory and functionalism, by and large, are not interested in individuals, and taken to their logical extremes, they don't even take any account at all of the individual. It's society and groups that are the focus of functionalist and conflict theory work. The work that they do, the sociological work that conflict theorists do and that functionalists do, by and large, is uninterested in the individual, and even in small groups. And one of the historical consequences was that they accepted functionalism, and conflict theory understands that at the end of the day, groups are made up of individuals. But they kept deferring, they kept delaying answering the questions, well, how do individuals fit into this theory that you're building? And they just kept asking the social question and leaving the individual out. And over time, starting in the 1940s, yes, it is problematic. And so what happened was sociologists began to say, well, look, these questions, they're not being answered. Maybe it's because of the theories that you're using to ask these questions. And so new approaches began to be taken, and they were primarily imported from other fields, primarily psychology. It was psychologists who were interested in social phenomena, but had been trained as psychologists, that is, trained to understand psychological processes in individuals, that began to interest themselves in the social dynamics of individual psychology. And the term that's given, it's not an especially helpful term for this approach. It's called symbolic interactionism. And it focuses rather, insofar as functionalism and conflict theory can be understood as top-down theorizing, symbolic interaction is bottom-up theorizing. And so using education, this time more elementary school or maybe even preschool as an example, functionalists and conflict theorists who wanted to study the school system, they would take a look at a school board, and they would gather data on, for example, a typical way of doing this would be to see what grades are boys and what grades are girls getting in different disciplines. So what's the average grade for boys in grade 7 in geometry compared to girls, or this kind of thing. Another version of it would be sociologists interested in education take a look at the wealth of the parents. What's the economic family situation that these different students in? Are rich students getting better grades than poor students? And so they do a top-down analysis, and they try to understand how does the economic structure predict or correlate with the educational structure. Symbolic interactionists, rather, they would go to the classroom and they would watch and they would see how interaction is occurring in a classroom. What's going on in the classroom? How are individual students reacting with each other, and how are they interacting with their teacher in such a way that it produces what was going on? And so to see how that can pay off, it was starting in the 1960s. The data had been accumulated that demonstrated that up until around grade 8, grade 9, girls did better than boys overall. So if you averaged all the grades that girls achieved in a school board, for example, and compared that to the average grade achieved by boys, overall girls had higher grades up until about grade 8, grade 9. And then after grade 8 or grade 9, boys caught up and then passed girls. This is in the 1960s. The data no longer looks like that, but I'm giving a historical account of the rise of symbolic interactionism. And the data was fairly well known, but it was not very well understood. And there were different kinds of explanations, but none of them satisfied sociologists. And eventually, and no macro approach seemed to be providing a successful answer. And then in the 1960s and 1970s, a Harvard education professor, Catherine MacKinnon, decided to take a look at what was going on in classrooms. And what she theorized that what was going on was that in classrooms, girls began to socialize with each other in different ways, such that they no longer felt like it was worth their while to get good grades. It was no longer important to girls to get good grades. And one of the things that symbolic interactionist sociologists observed was that teachers began to pay different kinds of attention. Teachers would ask boys more questions, and that allowed for a gendered differentiation in the classroom through the particular details of the classroom interactions themselves, a kind of explanation that no amount of macro analysis would ever reveal. And so symbolic interaction became a way of correcting for a kind of theoretical blind spot that's endemic to, that's necessarily part of the conflict approach and the functionalist approach. And so symbolic interactionism now successfully coexists with conflict theory and functionalism. Functionalism and conflict theory operate in a kind of competitive way with each other. These two sorts of approaches typically yield different sorts of explanations and different sorts of predictions for understanding particular distributions of inequality, or for proposing solutions to different perceived social problems. Whereas symbolic interactionism, by and large, has very little to say about the macro level, and it restricts itself to micro level interactions. The last, the most recent contribution to sociological theorizing is feminism, and in part as a result of a number of sociological factors, feminism increasingly occupied the theoretical attention of sociologists. This won't, I hope, be surprising. The higher percentage of women began to graduate from, so starting in the when it starts is a little bit open to some debate, but definitely by the 1950s, it had started. Women began to participate more and more women began to go to university, undergraduate first, and then over the course of the 50s and the 60s, as a certain minimum threshold of women began to increasingly participated in post-secondary education, first at the BA level, then at the master's level. Eventually, more and more women were getting PhDs. And then finally, those PhDs slowly, still to this day, more slowly than male PhDs, women began to get positions in sociology departments. And as more women got jobs in sociology departments, more and more papers were published, more and more conferences were held, more and more work was done focusing on feminism as a theoretical perspective. Now, what feminism as a theoretical perspective, and this is going to be a crucial distinction, an abstract distinction to make, feminism as a sociological theory is different from feminism as a political theory and feminism as a political movement. Feminist sociologists, although there's quite a bit of overlap between feminist sociologists and feminist sociology and political activism, nonetheless, from a theoretical point of view, feminism as a theory simply seeks to understand the persistence of unequal power distribution in given societies under different circumstances. And so feminism as a sociological theory starts, arguably, at least conceptually, starts from the empirical observation that men, under most historical circumstances, right up until today, men have more power in given societies than women do. Why is that? What are the consequences of that? How has that changed? So another empirical fact that that gives conceptual energy to and drive for feminist approaches is that historically, men have been losing power. Women have been taking power from men, women individually and women in groups. And so that in 2021, early next week, or early this week, sorry, on Wednesday, the first female vice president of the United States is going to take office. There's never been a woman vice president in the United States. And so that's one tiny little instance of women, the power of women increasing. Canada has had a woman prime minister very briefly. Does anyone know who that was? Canada's woman prime minister? Yep, Kim Campbell. Very good. So there's that, but there have been a small number so far, but there's been a number of very, very significant women political leaders. Can anyone think of examples of significant women political leaders? Margaret Thatcher, 100%. Yes. Anyone else? Well, we'll see. I hope so, but we'll see. Kamala Harris. Her achievement is notable, but she hasn't even been in office for one day yet. So we'll see. I mean, she was a senator and an attorney general in California. But I'm thinking of Indira Gandhi, the first female prime minister, Angela Merkel, what is her? Is she prime minister of Germany or president? I'm embarrassed to say I don't know. Chancellor. Thank you. That's right. Right. Chancellor. But there's Indira Gandhi in India, Golda Meir in Israel, Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand. Excellent. So there have been women leaders, women who've made contributions, and even historically there have been a few queens, Cleopatra in the Roman era, Queen Victoria, Queen Elizabeth I was a power, right? Bhutto in Pakistan was I think she was prime minister twice even, maybe. But so there have been some women. But overall, if we take a look at the sort of the broad scope of history, overwhelmingly men have had more power than women. Two different sorts related, but different sorts of questions have been asked from a feminist sociological perspective about that. Why is it? How is it? What has happened? What social dynamics are in place such that women historically have not had power? What does the rest of society gain? What does the rest of society lose when we do that? One of the many different features that feminist sociology has done is they've taken a look at the explanations that were offered for that the oppression of women in different kinds of societies, and over and over and over, it's turned out that the justification for that oppression has turned out to be based on lies, on a objectively mistaken characterization of whatever area those justifications came from. You're all, I imagine, too young to remember this anyway, but it wasn't that long ago, historically speaking, that there were no women doctors, that women were effectively frozen out of many, many, many different fields in which they are now widely represented. And so feminism as a sociological sociological theorizing perspective has emerged as a significant contributor to sociological knowledge only since a certain number of a minimum percentage of women were present in university departments to ask those questions and then to provide certain kinds of answers for those questions. Okay, so those are the four main theoretical approaches that will be examined in the course. In some of the chapters, there are a few other contemporary approaches that will be considered, but these are the four main approaches. These four approaches will recur regularly in the chapters, but I will continue to primarily focus on these two competing accounts, not so much because they represent the bulk of the contemporary work being done, but because the contrast between those two approaches is the easiest one to keep in mind when we try to understand how it is that society operates in general. Okay, so I took a look quickly at the grade book, and not all of you have completed the tests. And so please do so. Write those tests. Even if you've missed the deadline, write the test so that you can do well on the next test. It's only 2% of your grade, but you will see that at the end of the semester, you might be 4 points away from an A, and you might regret in April not having taken the 45 minutes, the hour, the 2 hours that would have been required to do a good grade. Holy cow. So let me just see that. Shulamith Firestone, sure. No. Well, the question of, so are they considered? You have to ask yourself, by whom are they considered? In order, women, historically speaking, men in power in the universities actively and passively oppressed women. They made it harder for women to at each stage, when women were very underrepresented, even in the bachelor's program, many men students and men faculty made it difficult on women, consciously and unconsciously, to participate equally as students. But women resisted that. Mothers insisted on making it possible for their daughters to go to university. Women students put up with the bullshit that many men imposed on them in classes, professor men and other student men, and they persisted. And over the course of several generations, they succeeded at the bachelor level, then the master's level, and they resisted. And so in order to succeed as a woman in society, some feminists argue that that in itself is a political act. There's no clear, theoretically neutral dividing line between sociological and political, is the sort of short answer. What do you think? I'm impressed that you even know. I think there's an E at the end of her name. I'm pretty sure it's Shulamith Firestone. Also, I thought she was a historian, actually. But in any event, I'm not sure. So maybe you could say a little bit. Why don't you turn your mic on and help me out? But you don't have to.
Hi, sir. Hello. Hello. Can you hear me?
Okay, well, our OUR is over. So I'm going to turn off the recording.